Welcome to Brew Cheese, where we brew up the finest of cheese. If you're new to our channel, we make budget-friendly deck techs, often with an unexpected twist to keep your playgroup guessing. Today's video kicks off a new series, Uncommon Core, where I present the core of a deck that costs $15 or less. If you saw our Shimmer deck tech, this is a similar concept, where a deck can go in any number of directions. With each uncommon core, I'll provide some suggestions, but where you go with it is ultimately up to you. The commander for this episode of Uncommon Core is Feather the Redeemed. She's a red, white, white for a 3/4 angel with flying, and all of your instants and sorceries that target one of your creatures go back to your hand at the end of the turn. Traditionally, she's used as something of a Voltron build, using cheap instants to pump her up for repeated value. But there are many instants that flicker a creature, and a lot of great enter the battlefield effects to be had in Boros, meaning that putting Feather at the helm of a flicker build will not only be a surprise, but an effective one as well. So what's our strategy? We're going to use flicker effects on as many players' turns as possible. Use that to repeat creatures enter the battlefield effects that you'd normally only get to do once, getting amazing value out of them. Those creatures can be whatever you want and go in whatever direction you want. And whatever you use, we'll ride it on to victory. Our ramp package kicks off with Star Compass, Boros Signet, and Talisman of Conviction, each of which costs 2 and produces red or white. Star Compass requires us to have a basic land that produces that color. Boros Signet filters 1 mana into 2, and Talisman of Conviction taps for either color, but pings us for 1 if we do. Marble and Fire Diamond each cost 2, enter tapped, and produce white or red respectively. With our commander costing 3 mana and having no generic mana in her cost, we'll need to pack every 2 mana or less mana rock that produces only colored mana. To that end, we're also running Gold and Iron Mirror. They're 2 CMC artifact creatures, each 1/1, and they tap for a white or a red respectively. Springleaf Drum may seem like a bit of an odd inclusion, but when we are flickering creatures to get their effects, it won't matter if they are tapped. We can even use it with Feather herself if we're not concerned about attacking with her that turn. One of the unique things about Feather is that she allows us to make use of cantrips that target our creatures to provide a source of card draw, something Boros generally struggles with. However, thanks to her ability to return spells to your hand, combined with the card draw we can repeat on everyone's turn, we'll often end up discarding cards instead of needing more draw. The draw suite includes Bandage, Defiant Strike, and Expedite, each of which draw a card immediately at the cost of 1 mana. Bandage prevents a damage, Defiant Strike bumps the power up by 1, and Expedite gives haste, but most of the time we're not too concerned with those parts of the card. Heal and Panic draw us a card on the next turn's upkeep, which can actually be a great thing, because we can cast this on our turn and get the new card after our discard phase, giving us more cards in hand for our opponent's turns. Niveus Wisps turns a creature white, taps it, and draws us a card. We don't care too often about one of our creatures being tapped, but make sure to be careful with this, as you may find yourself without a blocker. Because Feather and several of our pieces are integral to the deck's workings, we'll need a way to dodge spot removal, board wipes, and other attempts to ruin our plans. As a bonus, the spells here that grant protection from a color can be used to make one of our creatures unblockable in certain situations, or make them a better blocker in others. Ajani's Presence gives the creature +1/+1 and indestructible for 1 white, and we can pay 3 more for every other creature we want to include in this protection. Brave the Elements for 1 white gives all of our white creatures protection from a chosen color, and Feather is a white creature. God's Willing is also 1 white, and gives a single creature protection from the color of our choice. All of these are instant speed, so you can repeat them as needed. Shelter costs a white and 1, but it both protects a creature and draws us a card. Sheltering Light grants indestructible for a turn and scries for 1, and Stave Off grants protection from the color of our choice for 1 white. Acrobatic Maneuver, Ephemerate, and Cloud Shift each exile a creature and then return it. Acrobatic Maneuver costs a little more, but also draws us a card when we use it. It's worth mentioning that although Ephemerate has Rebound, both Rebound and Feather try to apply replacement effects that dictate what happens when the spell resolves. You can choose to allow Feather's effect to apply first and get it back in hand at the end of the turn. Justiciar's Portal, Otherworldly Journey, and Liberate each flicker a creature for a white and 1, except Justiciar's Portal gives the creature first strike until end of turn, and the others exile it until the end step, which we don't mind. It should be pointed out that all of these flicker effects can also protect a creature from spot removal, and the slow flicker effects can save it from a board wipe, as it will be gone until the end step. Between this and the other protection in the deck, it can be extremely hard to keep your key pieces off the field. We're playing one more flicker effect, although Settle Beyond Reality costs 5 mana and is a sorcery. However, you get to flicker a creature and permanently exile a creature controlled by an opponent. So although this is not as repeatable as the rest, and is a significantly higher mana cost, the fact that this can act as repeatable removal earns it a spot. Although not a flicker effect, Heat Shimmer and Twin Flame create a temporary copy of a creature. Heat Shimmer costs 3 for the effect, but lets you copy an opponent's creature if you wish. Twin Flame costs 2, but has the option to pay an additional 3 to copy an additional target, but can only copy your own creature. Since these both target, and a copy of a creature triggers enter the battlefield effects, we're placing them into the flicker category. Of course, if we're running these 2 copy effects, then we may as well include a second card that, when combined with either of them, creates an infinite loop that can easily win you the game. Dualcaster Mage is 2 red and 1 for a 2/2 human wizard with flash, and when it enters the battlefield, you can copy an instant or sorcery spell. On its own, Dualcaster Mage is a great addition to the deck because we can flicker it to copy an instant or sorcery an opponent has cast, letting us also benefit from things like our opponent's cultivates or demonic tutors. With the prior copy effects, however, they create an infinite loop. Here's a breakdown of how it works. We cast either of our copy effects, here represented by Twin Flame. It doesn't really matter what it's targeting, but here we're using Feather in the example. While we hold priority, we flash out Dualcaster Mage. Dualcaster Mage resolves and enters the battlefield, and we have its effect make a copy of Twin Flame still in the stack. The new copy of Twin Flame targets Dualcaster Mage, creating a token copy of it. Each of these copies, I should mention, have haste. The token copy of Dualcaster Mage enters and creates another copy of Twin Flame, which creates another copy of Dualcaster Mage, and on and on. Eventually, we let the original Twin Flame resolve, and we are left with an arbitrarily large number of 2/2 Dualcaster Mages with haste that we can use to swarm all of our opponents. Of course, things don't always go as planned, and we need to hit the reset button sometimes. Our board wipes in this deck are tailored to try to keep Feather and as many of our pieces alive as possible. Solar Blaze effectively causes all creatures to fight themselves, and Feather has 3 power and 4 toughness, meaning she'll survive. Earthquake and Magma Quake deal damage only to non-flying creatures, and Feather has flying. For all of these, we can also use our protective cards to give an important piece protection from red, or, in the case of Solar Blaze, its own color, and save that piece. Divine Reckoning lets each player choose one creature they want to keep and destroy the rest. We can of course pick Feather to save, but we can also cheat this system by giving another important creature indestructible, keeping it around as well. Urza's Ruinous Blast works similarly, letting us save Feather and lose all other creatures, but since they are exiled along with our non-land permanents, there's not as much hope of saving anything more than Feather. For the removal package, I've included Fiend Hunter, Oblivion Ring, and Cast Out, all of which exile something until it leaves the battlefield. However, with Fiend Hunter, there's a bit of a dirty trick we can play. If we cast it, or it enters the battlefield after being flickered, we can flicker it again while its enter the battlefield effect is on the stack. That means that its leaves the battlefield trigger goes on the top of the stack and tries to return a non-existent creature. Then the enter the battlefield trigger resolves and we permanently exile a creature. O-Ring and Cast Out are a bit more versatile, exiling any non-land permanent, with Cast Out having flash for 1 more mana. Crush Contraband costs a white and 3 for an instant, and it lets us exile an artifact, an enchantment, or one of each. Generous Gift destroys any permanent and replaces it with a 3/3 elephant. and Sky Tether simply gets a creature out of the air and onto the ground where it's not as quite a big of a problem, and gives it Defender to keep it away from us. Although the entire removal package is flexible in what you put in, I heavily recommend Rolling Thunder and Girad's Belligerence. They are more or less identical, both costing 2 red and X, and dealing X damage divided as you wish. Rolling Thunder has the ability to hit players, while Belligerence is limited to only creatures, and does some stuff with Populate, but we don't really care about that. If you point 1 point of that damage at a creature you control, and the rest wherever you want, Feather will return the burn spell to your hand to be reused next turn. Because the costs of our core cards are for the most part fairly low, and we don't want to delay playing them, we want lands that don't enter tapped and tap for our colors. The non-basic lands we're running are Battlefield Forge, which taps for either colorless, red, or white, but hits us for 1 if it produces colored mana. Inspiring Vantage, which enters tapped only if we have more than 2 other lands, and Command Tower, which taps for either red or white and enters untapped. The rest of our mana base consists of 22 plains and 12 mountains. You can opt to include things like Boros Guildgate, which enter tapped for the sake of consistency, but this mana base has been carefully balanced as there are almost twice as much need for white as there is for red in this particular build. The cost of the core of this deck comes up to $14.81. That total uses prices from TCG Player, not a sponsor, and does not include shipping, but does include cards in any condition. It's also only for the core of the deck, allowing the remaining $10 of the budget to be spent on the remainder. Although the direction you take Feather Flicker in depends ultimately on your personal tastes, here are some suggested starting points for various builds. Incorporating Captain of the Watch, Cloudgut Ranger, and Evangel of Heliod can net you a ton of soldier tokens with every trip around the table, with Captain of the Watch providing a +1/+1 to them and granting vigilance. Cloudgut Ranger letting you devote all of those soldiers it creates into bumping it into a huge flyer, and Evangel just straight up gives us an insane amount of soldiers every time it gets flickered. Lena, Selfless Champion, creates a soldier for each non-token creature we control, but also can sacrifice herself to save all of our small creatures if necessary. Launch the Fleet is, thanks to Feather, a reusable soldier factory, making another soldier for every mana we can pump into it. If we're going this route, I'd also suggest Acrobatic Crusader, as every time you target it, you get to make another soldier token. Of course, soldiers aren't the only token strategy in town. When you sit down at the table with a Feather deck, absolutely nobody is going to expect to be overrun with goblins. Beetleback Chief makes 2 goblins every time it's flickered, Chancellor of the Forge makes a goblin for every creature we control, and Goblin Marshal makes another 2. Siege Gang Commander makes 3 goblins when it enters, but also lets us funnel those goblins into dealing damage to a target, increasing our overall reach. Goblin Matron lets us tutor up a goblin every time she hits the field, and Volley Veteran repeatedly damages creatures every time it hits, doling out an amount of damage equal to our goblin count. Speaking of doling out damage, Demanding Dragon threatens to hit an opponent for 5 unless they sacrifice a creature every time it enters. Fanatic of Mogus hits each of our opponents for a damage for each point of red devotion we have, and Spawn of Thraxes deals damage to something for each mountain we have. Mirror Battlesphere not only makes 4 mirror tokens every time it gets flickered, you can turn all 12 of those, given 3 opponents, that you generated on opponents' turns, plus whatever you previously had, into a huge power bump for the Battlesphere, and deal an automatic chunk of damage to that opponent as well. Urbis Protector can crank out a 4/4 Flying Angel every time it's flickered, letting you quickly build up a winged battalion to join Feather in the air. One way to ensure your attackers get through is to make sure that nothing is untapped. Shrieking Mog, Thundermare, and Subjugator Angel will tap down all of our opponent's creatures, meaning that not only are all of our attacks guaranteed to go through, nobody but us gets to have a combat step, as we can flicker one of these before an opponent's combat to leave them no untapped attackers. Speaking of tapped creatures, Deadeye Harpooners destroys 1 every time it enters, so long as a creature left the battlefield this turn. That creature can be the same Harpooners that you just flickered, as it counts its own exile as a creature leaving the battlefield. Stalking Leonin exiles a creature attacking you, as you can not so secretly name the opponent that's attacking you at the moment. Sting Scourger can just simply bounce opponent's creatures, a rare effect in red, keeping each of our opponent's best creatures off the field. Of course, if you want great removal that loves being flickered, Meteor Golem destroys any non-land permanent every time it enters the battlefield. It's an initial 7 mana investment to do this, but the ability to wipe out planeswalkers, enchantments, artifacts, anything that's problematic, and do so every turn is indispensable. We can also flicker Emrakul's Hatcher to make 3 Eldrazi spawn every time, netting us mana so long as the flicker effect costs less than 3. And Rapacious Dragon gives us 2 treasure tokens when it enters, so we can come out ahead with one of our 1 mana flicker effects. Core Cartographer lets us throw out a tapped plains every time it enters, letting us quickly get all of the white mana out of our deck and into play. Direfleet Daredevil lets us cast an instant or sorcery from an opponent's graveyard every time it enters, and lets us pay any kind of mana for it. Although how effective this is depends largely on the meta and how many instant and sorcery spells your opponents are employing. Since you are casting the spell itself and not a copy of it, if that spell targets one of your creatures, Feather can affect it, but unfortunately the rules say that if you try to put something in your hand that isn't yours, it goes to its owner's hand instead. So I wouldn't let Feather's replacement effect happen unless you're okay with your opponent getting to recast the spell. This could politically be a great tool, but only in a very specific circumstance. Angel of Grace prevents our life total from going below 1 due to damage for the rest of the turn after it enters the battlefield, making us much harder to kill. It should be noted that you still accrue commander damage even if your life total doesn't change, and you can still lose due to an effect that forces you to lose life. But for all other circumstances, you are nigh unkillable, so long as you can recycle the Angel. These next 2 cards are not budget by any means, but if you bought one of the Commander 2019 precons, then you may have one of them, and so I mention them here. Dockside Extortionist can, depending on the board state, give us an incredible amount of treasure every time it hits the field, while Solemn Simulacrum both draws us a card when the flicker effect exiles it, and lets us tutor up a land when it comes back. This has been the first edition of Uncommon Core, and I look forward to many more. I'd like to thank all of our viewers, and if you like what we're doing here, spread the word by subscribing, sharing, Morse code, or just leave a comment telling us what we missed and what you'd like to see in the future. Thank you again, and see you next video.